At the outset, heartfelt thanks to Professor Rajkumar for inviting me to this conference and offering me this opportunity to share some really incoherent thoughts, with you. I'm still not very certain whether anything that I'm going to say is going to make much sense, and in any case, whatever I'm going to say is embarrassingly simple. What I'll do is I'll address the issue of international rule of law because I am an international lawyer. But hopefully much of what I have to say would also apply to rule of law, or internal rule of law, or domestic rule of law, or however you wish to formulate this. And I thought international rule of law was of some interest because we were addressing the issue of globalization. And if I have the time, I'll try towards the end link the issue of international rule of law with internal rule of law. So my sort of essential argument would be, noting this down during the course of the first session, would be that beyond a minimalist understanding, and I think this is what Professor Singh was hinting at towards the end of his talk, that beyond a very minimalistic understanding of the concept of rule of law or international rule of law, the concept itself is, to my mind, elusive and contested. So there is a great degree of complexity which is embodied in the very idea of rule of law. And the reason for that is, as Professor Singh hinted, is that we use different conceptions of law in determining the whole issue of legitimacy of rules that Professor Peter Schack was discussing during his presentations. To my mind, there are at least three sets of alternative conceptions of law that are often used to frame the discourse on rule of law. And we need to, in some ways, be able to distinguish these or sort these out if we have to get a purchase over the idea of rule of law itself. And my examples would come from international law. So the first pair of opposites in conceptions of law in trying to come to grips with the idea of rule of law would be a positivist conception of rule of law versus what I would call a deliberative conception of rule of law. The positive conception of rule of law suggests that as long as a law has been adopted through prescribed procedures, whether these are prescribed domestic internal procedures or prescribed international procedures, those rules of law would possess legitimacy within the legal system, whereas the deliberative conception of law, which has, among others, been articulated by the German thinker Jürgen Habermas, suggests that only those norms or those rules of law deserve the label law, which have been arrived through allowing what he calls good arguments to prevail. Whereas in under the positive conception, as long as a rule satisfies, for example, if a law is adopted through a majority within the Indian Parliament, that would have the label law. Whereas the Habermasian argument is that this kind of law would lack legitimacy if the rules adopted are not based upon good arguments. So, for example, if the laws that are adopted simply because it is supported by a majority, even if the arguments that support the law are not good, they would be part of the structure. They would be part of the structure of rule of law. Now let me illustrate this from the domain of international law. For example, much of international law, as you know, is formed through adoption of international treaties or international conventions. And the process for negotiating, adopting, ratifying these conventions is laid down in a treaty, in another treaty called the Vienna Convention on Law of Treaties. And as long as the process described in the Vienna Convention on Law of Treaties or part of customary international law is adhered to, then those rules would be ascribed the label law and would be part of this complex of rule of law. Yet we constantly hear the critique from the civil society, from subaltern states, that in a number of negotiations, for example, in the WTO negotiations, much of the negotiations takes place without subaltern states, marginal states, or the civil society being heard. And if many of you will know that the negotiations are carried out in what is known as the green room, or the green room negotiations, which are carried out only between a small group of states. Now, which means essentially that these are not carried out democratically on the basis of what I was saying, allowing good arguments to prevail. And these good arguments can come from any quarters, from a small actor or from a powerful actor. And therefore, some of the WTO rules tend to lack legitimacy. And once the legitimacy of rules are undermined, it tends to chip away at the very conception of rule of law, which I'll try and elaborate presently. But to give you another example from international institutions, which is now currently being debated in the G20 negotiations, relates to the functioning of the international financial institutions. I'm taking the example of really powerful actors in the international system. So, for example, the World Bank and IMF, as you know, the decisions are taken there on the basis of weighted voting. And one of the issues that has emerged post-economic crisis is how the sort of voting structure of these financial institutions now needs to reflect the new realities of the emerging powers of India and China. And very recently, only a couple of days ago, Mr. Pranab Mukherjee said that there was, and as recorded in the past, some agreement of reallocation. But the issue is the same again, that many of the decisions, much of the legal interpretations that are advanced by the international financial institutions of international monetary law are suspect in terms of legitimacy because they are simply arrived through prescribed procedure and not on the basis of what one would describe as good argument. So what I'm simply hinting at is that rules are often adopted through exercise of power rather than argument. And it is this marriage of power and rule making which tends to undermine the legitimacy of rules. Now, the second sort of set of opposites through which one can contest or suggest that the idea of rule of law is not as simple as it appears to be, is to contrast what I would call the formal conception of rule of law versus the substantive conception of rule of law. The formal conception is very much the accompanies the notion of a positive conception of rule of law, where it is simply suggested that by rule of law is meant the observance of all the participants in any legal system of the rules that have been adopted through prescribed procedure. Whereas the substantive conception of rule of law goes further and tries to look at the very character of the legal system, which is sustained through the idea of rule of law. And all of you will recognize that the concept of rule of law tells us absolutely nothing about the character of the legal system. So arguably there was rule of law during the period of colonization, that there was some form of rule of law while British colonialism existed in this country. That at the international level there was rule of law even when large parts of Asia and Africa were colonized. There was international law and there was some form of international rule of law. One can say that because under the formal conception, all that one has to do is to recognize the existence of a set of rules arrived at through prescribed procedure, and then argue that those rules have to be observed. Or to put it differently, the idea of rule of law has very, very weak link with the idea of justice. So the idea of rule of law tells us, as I said, very little about the justice, about the justice of the rules. This is a very old argument, but we need to bear this in mind, because simply saying that there is rule of law in India is not enough. We have to go further and understand the nature and character of the rule of law that prevails. And that I think the previous speakers were hinting at when they said that, is it fair justice that, half the people of this country are deprived of access to justice, delays, etc., etc. A third sort of problematic with the notion of rule of law is that it's an accultural notion, and something that, again, Professor Singh had mentioned. I was just recently reading Werner Minsky, and Minsky argues that there is this, that the entire idea of rule of law as it's been transported from the West is one which has an assumed superiority on one hand, that there is only one singular, unique idea of rule of law or of international rule of law, and that there is nothing that, as he puts it, that there is nothing that can be learned from the global south or from non-Western cultures or from the non-West about the meaning of rule of law. Even in a very ordinary sense, at the international level, for example, any traditional textbook would, on international law, says that international law has evolved and developed in the West after the middle of the 17th century, and there's almost no even gesture towards the contribution of the non-West to the complex of ideas, to the growth of international law, or the complex of ideas that it can bring to the table today in terms of advancing the cause of international rule of law, or the development of rule of law. So, in short, I think we need to interrogate the idea of rule of law much more closely than we are doing, than we often do. Very briefly, I just wanted to say that what is happening at the international level